Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the third episode of the Hum Aahang Baat Cheet podcast, and today we have with us two very special people. I will definitely fail at introducing them, and so you would have to watch the rest of the podcast to really know what they're about. We have with us the first person who will act as a host with me is Fatima Anwar. She is a graduate of LUMS class of 2017, if I'm not wrong. She is a lawyer by training, but a research analyst at the Engage Foundation for Research and Dialogue. Her work centers around blasphemy and how those laws are basically being used and their historicity. And also, recently, she's been working on civic education in Pakistan and trying to make sure that all of these ideas are accessible to the people in their own language. Our second guest is Léopold Lambert. Mr. Léopold Lambert is an architect from France. He's also a political analyst. He's written a number of books, including Weaponized Architecture. Right now, more currently, and for a long time now, he is the chief editor and the founder of the Funambulist magazine that basically identifies different spaces and how those spaces are used by different states to exert their power. Um, but I think I would leave it at that, and I would request Leopold to tell us a bit about himself, how he came about this field, and where how the magazine is doing, and what he plans to do for the coming few years.
Thanks, Kumail, and thank you, Fatma, for being with me on this episode. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today. Um, so yeah, as you said, I'm a trained architect. I'm not fully sure I would still define myself as an architect, but let's say that being trained as one has sort of shaped the way I connect to the world. So mostly through space, just like people might connect to it through, I don't know, symbolism, human relationships, uh, time, smell, who noise, who knows. So for me, it's more space, um, and um, and yeah, I sort of share my activity between editing and writing. Writing is a little bit less, is something that I spend a little bit less time on, but I've been working on a book about what I call the French colonial continuum for the last 5 years that will come out in France in April next year. And then, yeah, most of my activity has to do with publishing, editing this magazine that I created, the Funambulist, that really tries to, as you said, that tries to approach political struggles through space, but also tries to very much develop internationalist forms of solidarity between political struggles,
Hmm.
mostly the sort of anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles, but also in also queer and feminist and other sort of um, political struggles against forms of oppression, if we may say it like that.
Yeah, Fatma.
I don't know if you guys like talked a little bit before turning, like before I joined, but I'm just really excited to be on this podcast. I have to say that before I ask my first question, because I think that your writing and your magazine, it was something that I was looking for a very long time. I came across the idea of architecture as violence in high school, and I remember it completely shifted the way that I looked at the world and interacted with space, because I had never thought of space as consciously politicized before. Like I had felt it, like as a woman, for example, you feel when you go outside that space is political and the way that you exist in that space is political. But trying to find writing, and especially accessible writing on spatial politics and on architecture was really, really difficult. And I came across your magazine in, I think, my second year of university when I wanted to write an essay on the violence of colonial architecture. And I came across this blurb on your site on the slave ship as architecture. And I remember being so fascinated that, you know, there was somebody doing this work and that it was available online and that you could see it and it was accessible, because everything else, like I had to like, especially because I'm in Pakistan, so I had to like go through like weird VPNs to like download different essays, like, and it was really hard for me to find something that I could use. So one, I love the work that you're doing. I think it's absolutely incredible. And then especially the work on Palestine. Palestine has always been very close to my heart for a really long time. And I was so sad when I realized that your book on Palestine was in French, because I can't read French. So, you know, I would love to talk about some of the research that you published in there as well. But I think the place that I would like to start with is for a newer audience or for young students who have not studied spatial politics. How would you, for example, describe this field to them, or the importance of this field to them? Because I think a lot of times when you think of architecture, you think of it as a very apolitical thing. If you're not already in the field or if you're not already studying it, you think, oh, they're buildings, right? They're just around us. And you don't, and also you don't think of architecture as something destructive, because it is a physically constructive endeavor. So like a double-ended question. One, like a brief introduction, I think, from your end on why you think the politics of space is important. And then also an introduction for the students on how architecture or space can be destructive or violent in the way that it exists, like inherently.
Thanks, Fatima, and thank you very much for your very kind words, and which really means a lot. And by the way, my very first book, Weaponized Architecture, is on Palestine and is in English. So,
oh yeah, I meant the new one. So
yeah.
I've seen Weaponized Architecture, and I meant the new one that was specifically, I think, on the Palestinian ruin.
Yeah.
That's when I saw that one was in French. I was like, it's in French.
Yeah, that one is called in French. It's called the Politics of Bulldozer, and perhaps I can get at it in the second part of the question then. But it's a very small book, so don't worry. It's
okay.
Yeah. So I think, you know, for the last, let's say, at least 10 years, maybe 12, my definition of architecture has not evolved. It's the way I approach architecture is to designate it as the disciplines that organizes bodies in space. So that can seem a little bit abstract, but I think just looking at all around us right now, I mean, the three of us are in a room. I mean, not in the same room, sadly, but we're each of us are in a respective room. People who would be listening might be in a room as well. They might be outside. I don't know, but chances are there's very, very little chance, I suppose, that people when they will hear this will have no sort of architectural environment around them. Very, very little chance. And so then we can all look at what composes this architectural environment around us and see how we sort of take it for granted, and we don't really think about it so much. But like we can't cross the walls that surround us right now. We cannot go through them. We can maybe try to go through the windows depending on which floor we're at, or for myself, like I have a small access to Parisian roof. If you're careful, you can sort of go. But the fact is that everything has been made in such a way that the only sort of path you would use in the room you're in right now would be through this little device that we call a door. And so perhaps it's okay. You know, I'm not saying, oh wow, what's this dictatorship of architecture that is telling us that there's only one space, that one path we can take, or this kind of thing. Is like, perhaps it's fine. Perhaps I don't mind having to use that door over there to go out of my office when I have to. But the fact is, we are dependent on this spatial scheme. And the one maybe the three of us are in right now is a spatial scheme that materialize something that we might call private property. And the same thing, for better or for worse, maybe we're happy to be able to be in a space without being bothered by the external world, and maybe we're lucky to have that space, and we can feel safe in it, and all that kind of things. I mean, I'm actually for a critic of private property, but the fact is, I mean, I'm in this office right now, and I'm able to do my work because I'm not being bothered by someone coming in or something like that. But so those walls that surround us, the three of us at the very least, I think, are forming this political regime we call private property. And again, saying that is not yet deciding whether we're for it, against it, or anything, but it's just noticing it. And then there are other political regimes that that forms those walls. Some of the walls that surround us, sometimes there can be walls that prevent us from accessing some parts of the city. We had in our very first issue of the magazine, we had a whole piece on Lahore by Sadia Shirazi about this very topic in the context where you are yourself. I've been looking at it at a Parisian scale as well many times. And then there are even more violent political regime. I mean, we can think of prisons, we can think of police stations, we can think of military bases. We can think even we were talking about Palestine, we can think of all the sort of settler colonial apartheid apparatuses that are built with architecture to dominate and control Palestinian people by the Israeli state. And so we can think of all those things, but my point is that we can think from the most sort of from something that looks like it's, as you said, apolitical, but that is very much political. And exactly like you said, Fatma, I think this is something that probably people who are in a situation of a sort of engineered social category of oppression, be it the gender dimension, being a woman, or being maybe not identifying with any of the two sort of genders that are given to us, or in the case of architecture, I think having a disability is a very sort of obvious way that you would feel that architecture is always violent to your body. Because disability is not something that is, disability is not something that is absolute. Like, you always have a disability in relation to something else. You have a disability because other bodies have been deemed abled, and so the world was built around those abled body, and it's not, it doesn't exist, disability as a sort of absolute concept. And then in various contexts, we have also, I mean, it's rare to have a political context, when you don't have processes of racialization of groups, and similarly, architecture tends to be always more violent towards this group. And in a colonial context, and I'm thinking, I mean, not too far from where you are, in the case of Kashmir in particular, this is something that obviously becomes even more extreme. But so it's at every scale, and it just the violence of architecture is at every scale, applies in every situation. It's just that sometimes it's obviously more intense than others. And then for the second part of your question, which relates a little bit to both this small book I wrote in French about Palestine 4 years ago, and an issue we did of the magazine, our 11th issue. So that was I believe it was May, June 2000. 17, I believe. I'm getting lost. We have 32 issues of the magazine now, so I'm getting lost in when we did which one. But this one was called Design Destructions, and it was the idea of looking at how the destruction of architecture itself, in particular by colonial states, um, was on the cover was a Uyghur person who had seen the Chinese state destroying their house in Kashgar. Um, how the destruction of architecture itself was also a form of architecture, because for me architecture again is the organization of bodies in space and the sort of transformation of the built environment. So destruction is also a transformation of the built environment. For me, destruction is also architecture of some sort, because it is a way to imagine space and to sort of apply political force onto space. And of course, similarly, the destruction of infrastructure can happen at war, but it can happen in a much more sort of surgical way. And even at war, it can be very surgical in a pretty terrifying way sometimes. But just like there are architectures that are meant to control people, so the destruction of architecture is also a way is always part of a big scheme of spatial exclusion and violence.
When you're talking about destruction as part of architecture because you're still controlling space, I think again and again, like I think of Palestine. I think Palestine is an interesting example because what happens in Palestine is then taken by other states and exported elsewhere. So for example, in occupied Kashmir, a lot of the tactics that are used by the Indian military there are sort of directly plucked from the IDF in Palestine. What I thought was interesting when you're talking about destruction, right, is because so much of the political project of colonization is dependent on the way that you're allowed to look at a space. Because we're talking about land and we're talking about people and their relationship to that land. So then the way that you construct and organize that land says a lot about the people who live there, who are allowed to live there, who are allowed to function there. So what I was reading, I think it was, again, about your fourth book. I think you did a little English blog on it. And the part that I found the most interesting was, so you're talking about the destruction of the Palestinian home, right? Because one of the obviously a settler colonial project, what it does to an indigenous people is steal on one land, right? On a physical sense. But then also there's an ideological project of trying to disappear people. And they also do that through architecture, which I found was really interesting. Was I remember in high school, I read about the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, and how they got loads of donations to basically make the desert bloom, right? To plant trees and forests across historical Palestine. And then I remember reading either in, I think the Israeli historian Ilan Pape, he writes about the fact that they purposely planted forests over the ruins of Palestinian villages so that even the ruin as a sort of acknowledgement that people used to live here or existed once, even if we've destroyed something, even that ruin itself would disappear. So like the evidence of the destruction itself also has to be spatially disappeared to sort of back up the ideological narrative of the Israeli state. So I would actually love it if you could go into a little bit of detail actually about your research on Palestine, because I think it's something that the students listening to this podcast would be really interested in. And I think that the lessons that we learn from Israeli architectural violence in Palestine, it, like I said before, it extends to Kashmir, it extends in Pakistan to Balochistan. If I talk to Baloch activists in Pakistan and they talk about occupation, the way they talk about checkpoints, the way they talk about that spatial organization, it immediately reminds me of the research that's been done on Palestine. So I would love it if you could go into a little bit of detail about what you've studied there and what you think some of the most like poignant aspects of that are.
Yeah, absolutely, and perhaps as much as I agree as saying that the Israeli tactics and strategy have been influencing many other sort of settler colonial projects. I think before that, the European settler colonial project has informed Zionism as well, and Europeans are responsible also for the settler colonial conditions of Palestinians, through which Palestinians have to live. And in particular French colonialists in particular. There was some collaboration, and Israeli officers came to Algeria to learn counter revolution from the French themselves. So whenever we see like over here in France, whenever in leftist group, like people say that France is influenced by Israel or France is influenced by the US, I'm like, well, yeah, but who created Israel and who created the US? It was the French and the British primarily. So let's not make ourselves more innocent than we are. We're at the origin of all this violence. Um, Yeah, so in this little book, I looked at the various historical chapters of destructions of Palestinian homes by the Israeli army or the Israeli state. But I tried to look at it from as if the destruction itself was an architectural project, like because after destructions we see a ruin, we see a debris. It looks very messy. It looks like very chaotic, and it does not really obey to a sort of order, but actually it does. It's all those distractions are obeying to a very sort of a very precise order that, as you said, is meant to disappear the indigenous people. Whether it's I'm not necessarily saying that the Israeli government has some genocidal strategy or something. Like it's not about it's not about some sort of secret plot and even for having talked with many Palestinian friends about this, I think the term of genocide is not quite the one we should be using in the case of Palestine. But within each settler colonial project, there is a sort of almost unconscious drive to disappear the indigenous people in every means possible, and that's of course that's true in many other settler colonial projects. I mean, we must certainly see it in North America, we see it in Australia, uh, and um, and in other contexts as well, and most certainly in Palestine as well. And so disappearing a people, it doesn't necessarily just mean disappearing the people, but it also means disappearing the history of a people on a land. And in the case of Palestine, indeed, just like you mentioned, and Ilan Pathé is most definitely is probably the best person to read, to in particular his book The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Um, uh, uh, for which he I don't
Had
I
to
mean
leave Israel. Yeah.
yeah, he
Mm,
exiled himself. He
mm,
lives in London now. Sorry, in Exeter, so in the UK. And Sorry. So yeah, so I mean, during the Nakba, I mean, half of the Palestinian population living in Palestine had to flee their. I mean, were forced to flee their village or their part of town, in particular in Haifa and Nazareth, um, but and Jaffa, and then, as you said, I think, I mean, what I'm trying to say in the book and in those parts you must have read in English is that the rune as an architecture is an architecture that tells two stories. It tells a story of what it used to be, and it tells a story of how it got to become a rune. And that's true for every rune. It doesn't have to be like such a strong political narrative. It's just like you see an old shelter in the mountain somewhere, and it's in ruin, like you know that it used to be like, I don't know, like a place for sheep to and for the shepherd to spend the night at. And then you can probably tell that it got to that state by being just not maintained, and time and erosion got to this. But sometimes this erosion is precipitated by political forces, and of course that's the case of Palestinian villages in the territory that the state of Israel now consider as is, um, and um, and so a rune has, for the Zionist narrative, a rune has the danger of first telling that Palestinian people used to live there, which is not quite consistent with the Zionist narrative, and then that Zionist paramilitary forces before May 1948, and then the official Israeli army after May 48 destroyed those villages. So to make the settler colonial narrative consistent, because it's very important, like settler colonialism means like you need settlers, so you need like a civilian population, which in the case of Palestine is a little bit complicated because each Israeli person, for each Israeli woman goes for 2 years in the
military service,
and each man goes for 3 years. So settlers are civilians, but also they have like a very strong sort of military dimension. But still, like settlers needs to be able to believe in their own myth, otherwise they will realize that what their situation they're in is not the one that actually even liberates them. There's a lot of writing about like how the end of settler colonialism means also the liberation of the settlers themselves, because they live in complete perpetual state of paranoia and syndrome of oppression and all this, because of course there are resistance of indigenous people all the time. And so to be consistent with the Zionist narrative, but it is true really for most settler colonial contexts, then you need to erase this kind of anomalies, this kind of thing that disturbs the settler colonial narrative. And in the case of Palestine, that meant not just destroying villages, but years later destroying the ruins of the villages, and either by destroying them with bulldozers, like it's been done all over the 50s and beginning of 60s, or exactly like you said, like growing forest on it. And that's indeed the task of the Jewish National Funds that used to be collecting money all over the Jewish diaspora in the world to buy lands in Palestine for the Zionist sort of project to sort of actualize itself through a sort of capitalist endeavor of buying the biggest amount of land. And then of course in 1948 when Palestine was taken by the various Zionist paramilitary forces, then there was no longer any need to buy land because the land had been seized. And so the Jewish National Fund started taking care of national parks in what is known as Israel, and it seems here again, like even more than architecture, I think it's not very difficult to convince people that architecture is always political, but like go to tell people that trees are political,
right?
It's a little bit more, it's like, really? But then in that case, yes, because there, and in many ways, in ways to erase Palestinian villages, but of course, all the Jewish National Fund forests are not are not made just to erase Palestinian villages, but there's also as you said, like this sort of like biblical prediction of like making the desert bloom, which is like by definition a settler colonial narrative, because it's like the desert has no one, has nothing, is this very sort of poor land, and then let's make it this European looking pine tree forest looking place where we could feel like Europeans, because of course Jewish Israeli citizens are not all Europeans, they're not all Ashkenazis, they're also Sephardi and Mizrahi, coming from Iraq, coming from Yemen, coming from Tunisia, coming from Morocco, Algeria, Ethiopia as well. But like the Ashkenazi and the white supremacy that is inherent to those European-based settler colonialism, of course, will always favor the whitest of the settlers. So in that case, Ashkenazi Israeli Jews, and so yeah. So it's like, let's make a little bit of Europe in this horrible place that is the Middle East. And then we'll play for UEFA in football, and we'll participate to Eurovision and all those kind of things. When clearly we're in the Levant, Syria does not participate to Eurovision, and all this. So yeah. Anyway, sorry, I was a bit long.
No, that's perfectly fine. We just talked about how architecture is, in a lot of senses, a destructive enterprise as well, and that might be considered as one of its like featuring seminal elements. Architecture could also be at the same time a deceiving enterprise, right? Like it functions on obscurity in a lot of senses. In that, and by that I simply mean that it uses naturally spaces which seem, as you said, which seem apolitical, but sometimes they also seem very democratic and very open to deceive a population into being surveilled or into being controlled. So I'm reminded of a few days back, I was reading Noam Chomsky's on anarchism, and he talks about his experience in a Jewish kibbutz, and he says that the thing is that over there, the architecture is apparently, it's like a village. It's very democratic. The organization of that space is very democratic. The sharing of resources is very democratic. But the only reason that they can exist is because the Israeli state says that you will give us soldiers, and every soldier who goes to the Israeli force from that rather democratically, architecturally aligned and democratically structured space is a nice soldier, which he basically says means that he'll do anything to save the state, right? So tell us, so if you could give us some examples about different pieces of architecture that are instituted, whether in Palestine or elsewhere in other states, which seemingly look quite passive and even maybe democratic or progressive, but are actually really furthering a narrative of space and power under that garb of being very egalitarian.
Yeah, so I will start by prefacing the fact that for me, it's very important that when we talk about that, we say that, or at least I say, because that's my conviction, that there isn't any architecture in which you enter and you become free. You know, you become emancipated. Like you enter this new space and then all of a sudden you're emancipated. But it's very important to understand that the opposite is true, though. There are spaces where you enter and you're prisoner. It's called prison. And so for me, architecture is not this sort of neutral discipline that can serve the powerful or serve the powerless. I mean, it is, but it's not neutral insofar that it's like, you know, it's one way or the other. It's like, it's almost always serving the powerful, to use this very simplistic sort of way of framing, but I think that makes it clearer. And often I say, look, it's like, what's easier than take like a line between a settler colonial line or a colonial line between two places, and then turn it into a wall. Well, in the case of Pakistan and India, it can be a little bit complicated because the line is going a bit crazy. But like usually, I mean, if you think of the U.S. and Mexico, like that's the line quite often is literally something traced on a map between two settler colonial states to prevent indigenous people from Central America to reach more northern lands. So what's easier than take this line and turn it into a wall? It's very easy. Very conceptually, at least. I mean, you know, then there's the money aspect and many different things. But like conceptually, there's nothing easier. Whereas thinking of architecture that is sort of are democratic or are somehow resistive or something like that is much more complicated conceptually, sorry. And perhaps one example I like to give, because there's this sort of like very nice little narrative that says, build more bridges, less walls, something like that. And it's true. I mean, a bridge is seemingly like a very nice sort of
Connection.
piece of infrastructure that links people together, and we can have like an entire imaginary of very nice sort of peaceful narratives that fit with that idea of the bridge. And it's true. I'm not trying to say no, the bridge is a horrible instrument of oppression or anything like that, but let's try to think a little bit more, because what is a bridge? A bridge is constituted by its narrowness. It can be a very wide bridge, but it's going to always be narrow. Like a bridge is always longer than otherwise it's not really a bridge. It's more like an overpass, or like, I mean, it's something else. And narrowness in architecture is what fundamentally allows for control of bodies. It's because it's easy. In a bridge is a corridor. You have point A, point B. If you control point A, then no one will pass. If you control point A or point B, then you can even stuck people in the middle. I mean, I was thinking back in my days when I was part of Occupy Wall Street. I was living in New York back in 2011, and people got arrested in the Brooklyn Bridge, because there were many of people who were part of Occupy Wall Street were very, very new
and
in
the
political
Black Lives
activism
Matter movement as well. They were stuck on the Brooklyn Bridge, and they were
stuck there.
cordoned off from both sides.
Yeah, because a bridge is there's nothing easier for forces of police or military forces to control, right? And in Paris we have a tragic examples of one of the biggest massacre in Paris since between the Second World War and to today. Today is November 13th. It's our fifth anniversary of the attacks in 2015 that killed also many people, friends included. But the other examples of I'm sorry to call it like that, but of a bloodbath in Paris was on October 17, 1961, when towards quite the end of the Algerian Revolution, there was a curfew declared on only Algerians in Paris by like a horribly colonial and racist prefect of police. 30,000 Algerians took the streets to protest against it in the absolute most peaceful manner, and they were met with batons, they were met with handcuffs, they were met with detention, but also they were met with guns and bullets, and were killed on bridges, because also the I don't know if you picture this, but the river in Paris sort of crosses the middle of the city, but then it does like some weird turns, which means that for many Algerians, you literally had to cross two bridges to actually reach the center of Paris. And bridges again are the easiest moment for forces of police to control people and even to shoot people. And this massacre is known for its horrific characteristic as well, that Algerian people were being thrown in the river from the bridges as well. So if you take there would be a book to write about the history of bridges, like the nice little bridge that you might build on that might link two river banks, one with another, maybe two countries one with another, but there's also that dimension of things. So I think there's never ever any example of an architecture where we would say like, okay, this is for us, like this is what we want. Even a barricade, right? Like a barricade is a sort of like, especially for like at least in Europe, like for white male leftists, it's like, it's barricade, the 19th century revolutions and all that. That's when we were strong. That's when we were resisting to the police and to the army and all that. Well, they were barricaded by fascist forces as well. I mean, especially in Algeria. So I mean, of course, a barricade is not going to be an architecture of revolution, of our revolution all the time. It can be also the architecture of a fascist project.
I'm really I really wanted to also talk about Algeria and French colonial architecture there, because I think like, for example, me and Kumail were talking about this yesterday when we were discussing what to talk about in this podcast, is because I think that's something that we could learn a lot from here in South Asia, is because we constantly are confronted with the leftover sort of not even leftover, but a continuation of a colonial way of thinking when it comes to organizing cities and space. And I also really like the fact that you have already started talking about ideas of an architecture of resistance or revolution and whether or not that exists. So one thing that I'd love to hear your thoughts on as far as Algeria is concerned is I found this paper a while back that was, I'm gonna butcher his name, I'm so sorry, but there's this really famous French architect, Le Corbusier.
Swiss, yeah.
Yeah, Swiss? I thought he was French.
Well, he was given the French citizenship, but
so and I saw that he had been given this project to organize Algiers. And it never came into being, obviously, and the Algerian Revolution happened, and so that project never came into being. And I don't know if it was, I think it was just a proposal. But I remember one of the main components of it, right, was this highway, this really large road that would allow French settlers to travel in a way that they would not have to see the Algerian residential areas, while at the same time keeping Algerians close enough that when you need people for your factories, for your workspaces, for all of that, that they could travel through smaller roads underneath to come to work and go away without necessarily ever having to interact with the facade of this, beautiful colonial city. And this is something that I think we see a lot in Pakistan. For example, if you go to the very nice areas of our city, for example, in Lahore, if you go to the Defense Housing Authority, and what you see, right, are these very beautiful houses, these wide roads, and then very strategically close by, but almost invisible ghettoized areas. And the reason partially, right, is that because even though and over here, this is a class thing, is that even though you need, for example, these areas need the labor of the people who live in those ghettoized areas, but they don't want them to be seen. They don't want them to be visible in the spaces that they live in. And I think that this is something, at least in South Asia, that is a direct continuation of a colonial way of thinking about the way, especially in terms of settler colonialism, because settler colonialism wants to live in a space and exploit the land and the people of that space, but also not confront them, because you want to live in this, especially for like European settler colonialism, you want to build white spaces, and you don't want to see the brown people who are going to make those white spaces possible. So and something that I found interesting about Algiers, right, was this annoyance that French authorities had with the Kasbah, because it was hard to control, because there were narrower streets and there were rooftop pathways that the revolutionaries could use that were hard to get to. And so basically, I would love to hear your thoughts on colonial architecture and the way that post-colonial states, have like a continuation of that sort of thinking. And then also to sort of investigate a little bit more this idea of an architecture of resistance, because I don't want to live in a world where we can't have, for example, architectures of resistance. I understand it's easier to control with architecture, but I want to know like what your thoughts are on okay, what's the other side? Like, as people, as organizers, as activists, like, how do we think about space? And for example, future architects, students of architecture, if they want to build spaces, right, that are for people, and or at least in their own way try to resist this sort of dominant way of doing architecture, like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and before, sorry, you answer that, Leopold, I would just like to add to something Fatma said a bit earlier, also for the audience who could relate. But so she mentioned Lahore and how, like these housing societies have sort of obscured these places where the people who belong to a lower class live. We were talking about bridges. Almost every bridge now that I think about in Lahore has basically what you would call a slum under it, and it's consistent. Like every bridge would consistently sort of obscure these places. So it's almost like a bridge is trying to not only obscure, but it naturally gentrifies that space, or it's like almost a line of gentrification that is going through right at the heart of these slums. So yeah, I just wanted to add that just so we could relate. And yeah, could a space be reclaimed? I feel like is a very necessary question for sure.
Um, yeah, great. So when it comes to Le Corbusier, I think so. When it comes to Algiers, it was actually much earlier than the Algerian Revolution, but it's also Le Corbusier had like plans for every city. It's like he wanted to destroy the entire center of Paris and create like high-rise buildings and big highways and all that. And more interestingly as well, he proposed to Mussolini himself like a plan for Addis Ababa when Italians fascists invaded Ethiopia. But closer, much closer to us, which to you, sorry, I wish it was us, but much closer to you, on the other side of the border, but still in Punjab. The entire city of Chandigarh was master planned by Le Corbusier. And what I find very interesting in this narrative, always of new cities, is that um, uh, there's always this narrative, just like a settler colonial. I mean, of course, in the case of India, it's a little bit different because India is not a settler colony per se, but then you can find sort of local um, at a more local scale, like there is something always of like the state saying like, okay, there was nothing and then we built a new city. So in the case of Chandigarh, it's absolutely not the case. It's like there was small villages of farmers that did not exactly got destroyed. I mean, the fields were expropriated for the city to be able to exist, but quite amazingly, and I'm indebted to my former colleague when I was working in Bombay, Mayank Ojha, about that, who is from Chandigarh and who was kind enough to make me visit one day that part of the city, which is called Burel in particular, Burel was one of the former villages that was sort of in a sort of negotiation with this new city. I mean, something that was non-negotiable for the state of Punjab and Haryana was that they were not going to keep their field. Like the fields were needed to build a new city, but they were not going to destroy the village either. So they were going to be given within the grid of Le Corbusier, because Le Corbusier always built stuff with like in a very militaristic way, this sort of orthogonal grid, and within this grid, and not and in a square, but in a square that's not. Sorry, I know there's no video on this podcast. I'm making gesture, but the square. I'm happy to send you an image if somehow we're able to associate it to the podcast, but. Uh, those villages were given a square within the square, but a square that quite amazingly is not fitting the grid, like is clearly an anomaly. And the village ended up being evolving with its own rules, with its own even real estate, if we may call it like that, and became the place of life of many people who came from other part of Punjab or other part of India, and it grew to be what we might want to call like a very dense, labyrinthine. I'm saying labyrinthine with like, I'm making like quotation mark with my hands, because labyrinthine is always something that one might say about a neighborhood when this person is from outside the neighborhood, and when you're inside, you're not. Well, no, that's not a labyrinth. It's like I know where I am. I know where I go, and all this. But that's of course when it comes to the military and when it comes to the Casbah, as I'll talk about in just a minute. Then it is a labyrinth for the military, the counter-revolutionary forces. Um, and so just in the same region of Punjab that you are, we can find like the perfect example of a big fuck you to Le Corbusier's architecture, essentially, which is like this sort of Casbah in the most sort of rationalized type of city. And don't get me wrong, I mean, Le Corbusier, when it comes to architecture proper, you know, I go to his building and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Like I'm not, my problem with him is what it stands for politically, but as a sort of someone who's been trained in architecture, I'm also able to recognize, to see beauty in a piece of design, the way concrete was poured, or this kind of things. But that's off topic in that case. Um, and um, and so what is true here is true in Algiers as well. Um, uh, and Where the French actually, when they invaded Algiers in 1830, one of the very first things they did was to destroy an entire part of the Casbah, in particular the part that was touching the sea. And of course, Algiers was only the Casbah by then. Like it's the old city, it's the old Medina. Um, and they built like Haussmannian buildings instead. I mean, not immediately, but like in the few following decades. And Haussmannian buildings in Paris, you know, like which compose like the real Paris identity, which for most of it has nothing to do with Haussmann. It was later and imitation and all that, but was built in partially, not fully. I mean, there was many reasons, but partially for counter-insurrection purposes, because you know you had like those very dense working class neighborhoods that would revolt always. Like the 19th century in Paris is just revolutions after revolutions after revolution. I mean, most of them failed, but at least three of them did. And so destroying those neighborhoods and replacing it by like a big bourgeois building, or in that could also accommodate a part of the working class, in particular the servants and all that, was really an endeavor of counter-insurrection at very large scale. So in the case of Algiers, of course, it becomes even more needed to be counter-insurrectional, because in that case, it's not just the working class that's against the state. It's colonized people at large. And yeah, the Casbah has been resisting over and over and keep existing. And then during the Algerian Revolution, and in particular when the Algerian Revolution happened in Algiers, which was not really the case at the beginning, in 1957, then even though the Algerian revolutionaries of the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, even though they were in huge asymmetrical relationship of power against the French paratroopers, I mean, the French army was even more sort of for its time technologically advanced and strategically advanced than it is now. Thankfully, if it could be even less now, that would be wonderful. And so even though there was this very strong asymmetrical dimension, the very nature of that space of the Casbah, from where the FLN was organizing, allowed them to still operate from there for many months. They ended up losing, but it was like a battle lost, but the war would be won ultimately. but the reasons for that is, as you said, Fatma, is like it's because of the roofs that can connect to each other. It's because of the buildings were like are all semi-private, like several families live within it, but it's not like one building, one family, and so you can sort of enter, hide inside. People stop closing their door, locking their door, so you could, like, anyone who was chased by the military could enter. As I said, for people who don't know the neighborhood, it seems like very labyrinthine. It's very dense. You can be, if you're, if you're a French paratrooper, you could also be attacked without realizing it. I mean, going in the Casbah must have been a very scary thing for paratroopers, which is really an interesting thing that architecture could manage to do. But of course, architecture doesn't do it by itself. It needs revolutionary forces for it. So it just facilitates to a certain degree. And then to get to the final part of your question, I'm I'm probably within the architecture field like one of the person who is the most sort of I don't know, I was going to say angry at architecture, but like that is extremely aggressive about what architecture does. But yet I do not tell people who study architecture like don't do it, like don't, or do it, but like use your skills for something else than designing. Like use your skills to analyze, use your skills to you might know the group Forensic Architecture that has taken skills of architecture and used them to produce evidence in the case of in the case of Pakistan in drone attacks, for example. So that's one way to do it. That's a great way to do it. There's Forensic Architecture are the most famous people doing this, but there are also many other people who are doing it one way or another. And sometimes at much smaller scales, like I feel there's always like this very man kind of dimension of like, let's look at drone strikes, let's look at war, let's look at colonialism. But what about patriarchy in our own sort of immediate environment as well? So many people are using architecture skills to do this. But then I still think people who are convinced that they could design something that is sort of using all these political dimensions we talked about, even this violence to a certain degree. I mean, we don't want the architecture we want is not an architecture that is overly violent, but I'm still convinced that we cannot escape from this violence at least a little bit. So the question is, to whom is it going to be violent? Is it going to be violent against the French paratroopers, or is it going to be violent against the poor, the racialized, and the women, and the usual group of people who are the receptacle of this violence on a regular basis? And I don't have that many examples of architecture designed by architects, not designed by architects. I have many examples. I mean, the Casbah is one of them, of course, but designed by architects, I don't have that many examples of like of architectural practices of design that really I don't know, that really create what we might want to call an architecture of resistance. But there are some, and sometimes it doesn't need to be that. You don't need to put like a label of like architecture of resistance. Sometimes it's just at the scale of a neighborhood, something is doing like some very important work. So I would say like keep designing if you have the intuition that you could get somewhere with it. But even though it's a very difficult endeavor.
Yeah. Before Fatma moves on to her question, just like a short question, you mentioned how you can't name, or maybe very few can name very few pieces and buildings that are made by architects that actually support resistance. Is that because the subject is sort of taught in a way that is directly coming from that colonial thinking? Is it too skewed for an architect to come up with a building that resists or supports architecture, or at least maybe could be used in that sense?
I'd like to add a little to Kumail's question because it's kind of the same question I was going to ask, which was, I think, something that you said at the beginning, which is, I think this entire time we have been talking about colonial thinking, but we haven't been talking about, for example, capital. Because even to build a building, right, you need labor, you need money, you need material, you need the approval. So linked to Kumail's question about, is it colonial thinking, do you also think it is because just the resources to construct are in the hands of those who are just not inclined towards making architecture that is for people?
Yes, I mean, I think it's very clear. But perhaps if I try to insist a little bit more that architecture is not just a neutral discipline, meaning it's not just about, like, you know, to use some Marxian rhetoric, like it's not just about seizing the means of production for architecture to somehow now serve the good rather than serve the bad, to say it in a purposely ridiculously simplistic way. I think if I'm being a little bit provocative, I would say managing to be an architect who designs revolutionary architecture is a little bit like being a white person and doing revolutionary politics, like in the context of the global north, let's say. Meaning it's starting from a position of power, a position of privilege, and a position of dominance. Whoever the architect might be, I'm saying it's as if being a white person. Of course, in the global north, most architects are white people as well, but there is also, I think it applies in many ways to non-white architects as well. And so, you know, if I say that, like if I say like to be to be white and to be engaged in and revolutionary anti-racist and anti-colonial politics is a very difficult sort of balance tuning and to find. Similarly, is being an architect and starting from this position of dominance and managing to somehow create an architecture that truly addresses the sort of political organizing of a community that the building is supposed to serve, is a very, very difficult endeavor. And perhaps the best sort of the best solution for me, I mean, solution, I don't like that word, but probably the scenario in which we might be the closest from success in that matter is to be as little exogenous to that community. Like the least you're outside of this community, the more you have chances to perhaps do some good work. And also because you would no longer have this sort of position of like, I'm the architect, I know things, like I know what to do, I know all this kind of thing, and you would more be like, okay, well, I'm part of this community, or like I'm sort of very I'm close from these communities that I know very well, and I'm just like a person who has like some architectural skills that could be used by this community for a bigger project that belongs to it, and not and does not like have this whole you know, architecture skills are real, like it's what we are trained to to learn, of course. So it's not saying like anyone could do this, it's just a matter of saying like, listen, why would architects think of themselves as being more important than someone who fixes shoes? Someone who fixes shoes might have his or her little workshop in a given neighborhood, and then people of the neighborhood come to find him or her and to fix their shoes because their shoes are damaged. Then how come architects cannot be like also in a very humble way someone who has a little bit of skills and knowledge about space and about the built environment, and answer to a community with that skills, without telling the community what it should be doing and how it should be doing it, and all this. I think for me that would be like the closest that we might find an answer. Just like, I mean, you know, because I'm using I'm using the white person being involved in anti-racist and anti-colonial politics on purpose here, because that's of course my case, and I'm not sure whether I'm doing it well. But what I'm trying to do at the very least is to be as little exogenous from the communities that I'm trying to be in solidarity with, which also means that it also means that my pantheon is like all my imaginary is also the same. Like when I think of the Algerian Revolution is an incredible event in history. It's when actually as a white French, I should be thinking of it as like the defeat of my country, and I put some huge quotation mark here because I hate to say my country, but you know, the one that I'm being sort of by default associated to. No, the Algerian Revolution is an incredible event in my own sort of personal uh, in my own personal pantheon, and so the more you're able to do this sort of you know, some people use the term of traitor to their class, traitor to their gender, traitor to their race, all this. I think it's a little bit too self-important to call ourselves traitors. Like I feel it's very like, oh, I'm a traitor or something like that. So I don't need to use that word, but at least to sort of to not go for like the default scenarios that sort of that keeps advantaging you for absolutely no other reason than in which family you were born and in which social class you were born and which gender you were born and all this.
I know, I think you've given us so much of your time, and I think we have to end soon, but I think the the last thing that we kind of wanted to discuss was about a kind of like, there is like a communal personal responsibility, and then there's like a personal moral responsibility, right? When you interact with space and the way that you exist space, and then if you're an architect, the way that you are in your discipline, the way that you're constructing spaces. So I have a sort of, again, like a half and half question where on one hand, for people who are within the field of architecture, you know, what is the moral responsibility? For example, I remember a while back this article, right, that was discussing for example, the construction of a prison, right? You know, a prison is going to be constructed. As an architect, do you refuse to construct a prison because obviously it is a very, very violent piece of architecture? Or do you, for example, think that this is going to be constructed regardless, and can I do some good in making this building as humane as possible for the people who are going to end up here? And that is, to me, a very complicated, I think we see this in a lot of other organizing we do as well, where we're kind of dealing with these circumstances, and there is a complex moral question of what is the right thing to do? Like, are you just washing your hands of it? Okay, you know it's still going to be made, but you're like, okay, at least I am not responsible for that. Or do you think there is room to try and make the prison is an extreme example, but a lot of buildings, to make them more humane, because you know regardless that they are going to be built at least the way capital and the way state power currently exist. So that's one half of it. And then the other half of it is, to me, the personal sort of way that one relates to architecture. So for example, whenever I go to a historical site, some beautiful like old Mughal building, or I don't know, you go to Dubai. I hate Dubai, to be honest, but like you go to Dubai and, you know, you see the Burj Khalifa or whatever, and you know that these buildings that are already built, they already exist now, but that they were built on the blood and the exploitation of the labor of so many people, and literal blood, because when the Burj Khalifa, for example, was being built, many laborers died or committed suicide because of how horrifying those circumstances were. But now the building exists, it's already there. So I have this, it's almost an hypothetical question, but it's also, I think, a serious one for like long-term thinking about architecture, is how do we confront and how do we relate to these buildings, these things that already exist? Is like the answer, oh, you know, say this hypothetical revolution comes, do we break them all? Do we destroy them all? Or how do we relate in these cities that have already been built for us with so much exploitation? And so how do we relate to them as people who want to be conscious of where these buildings came from?
Thanks. Those are two super important and great questions. The first one, so I don't believe in moral responsibility. I don't know what moral responsibility is. I believe in political responsibility or political consistency, meaning if, as an architect, say, you have no problem with the carceral societies in which we live that puts people into cage, if you have no problem with it, then I will fight you, but I won't tell you you're full of shit. Like I will tell you, I will tell you you're my political enemy or adversary, let's say. But then then it's normal. You're gonna design prisons, and then you're gonna design. Everybody who designs prisons tries to design them with a bit of a more humane kind of way, in the way they imagine human conditions to be. The fact is, there is absolutely no prison that can be built in what we might call humane way. You're literally putting people in cage. Like it's just the most violent form of architecture you can find. So I don't. So if you agree, if you support the carceral system, then we'll fight you, but do what you do, like, so to speak. Or if on the other hand, and in the case of many architects all around the world are like what we might call like center left people, like they're not very radical in politics, but they also want they also don't want to be horrible people. Like they want everybody to get along with each other. They want the world to be like a better place. All this kind of like cliche of vision. So if you're telling me that you have respect for human life, and that you understand that that something we call crime is also a political construct that emanates from various social conditions, and all this, then don't come find me and tell me like, oh, but I'm going to design a prison, but I'm going to design it in a slightly better way or something like that. Like, there are no better prisons. There are only prisons. So, and that's why we had like a pledge for architects and architecture students to take that they will promise to never design any space of detention whatsoever in their entire career. But as you very aptly say, prisons are the most extreme form we can think about. But then what about banks? What about hearing you, it seems like in Lahore it might be just as much the case as in North America or Europe. Like the fact of like designing buildings for sort of privileged middle class that would like sort of evict an entire working class population, sometimes racialized as well. I think for me, this way of dealing with this is a matter of what we may call red lines. Like you have to have your own political red lines, things that you're willing to negotiate with, because we're in a capitalist system, and we need to sometimes negotiate our own conditions of existence ourselves. But I think we need red lines. So, for example, I no longer practice, but for me to be designing when I was working in New York, like to be designing a housing project for like white middle class instead of Black and Latinx poorer population in many parts of the city, in Brooklyn in particular, would have been an absolute red line. Like it's not. I would have not do something dramatic about it. I would not be like, I quit or something like that. But just like, no, don't make me work on this project. Like and that would be my negotiation. It would be like, well, I need to pay my rent. I need to keep working in this office that I'm in. Well, I ended up being fired, but but I need to keep working for this office. So I just won't participate in any of it. And then the second part of your question, I think, is very important, because for me, it's less a questions of building. It's not like, am I going to enter or look at the Burj Khalifa because of the blood on which it was built? But much closer from me, like the many buildings. Maybe less in Paris and more like in for example, in the capital city of the region I come from, which is Nantes, which is a city that is built on the wealth created by slavery on the other side of the ocean. Does that mean I should not look at those buildings? Does that mean I should not enter those buildings? No, I don't think so. But I think it's not a question about buildings. I think it's a question about colonialism. It's like when we liberate ourselves from colonialism, do we destroy everything and then build anew, or do we? And I think many people have talked about that when it comes to language. We're talking in English right now. There's reasons for it, at least for you to have learned English at some point. For me, it's not. It's a little bit different, but many incredible writers from the global south are writing in a European language. Does that mean we should unlearn those languages and talk only vernacular languages? I think no. I think both. I need to learn. I need to learn Urdu or Punjabi, for example. But I don't think you should unlearn English for some reason. And so here again, I think it's a matter between red lines and negotiations, because there are things that needs to be destroyed. I mean, we started with Palestine, we can end with Palestine. Of course, when Palestine will be free, many things will need to be destroyed. Many architecture of violence should be destroyed. But then we're not going to destroy everything. We're not going to burn the forest of pine to the ground.
Yeah.
That's not the idea. And so this is negotiation. How do we reappropriate something that was once used for colonial purposes and make it for a new society, in a complete different ways than the sort of what we might call the bourgeoisie of the global south have been doing in a post-colonial context, which is, as you pointed out, basically adopting the same sort of behaviors and the colonial elite was adopting, and instead trying to find decolonial modes of living, which is really not easy. I mean, just like architecture, architecture of resistance is very difficult to conceptualize. Decolonized modes of living, very, very difficult to imagine, but we need to still fighting for it.
Yeah. And here's to hoping that I love the fact that you said when Palestine would be free, and then I hope we keep using that that word when to refer to all of these. Yeah, instead of if, when all of these things will happen, because those sort of do point out towards, as you said, an imagination and a need for imagining a place where we could design for ourselves a decolonial world. And then
Kumail, it's for me, I get really inspired by some things that I think happens in many colonized contexts, but the one that I'm the most familiar with regards to this in particular would be in what I want to call Kanaki, which is this country over there. You see the flag behind me, which is the indigenous name of New Caledonia, which is still a French colony in the Pacific Ocean right now, but and hearing old Kanak indigenous people saying something along the lines of, "It's just a matter of time. We'll have our country one day or another. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and we have time. We've been here for 3,000 years.
Yeah,
we can wait a few years more. Doesn't matter. I mean, it matters, but it's just an absolute certainty. So let's start saying more when rather than if, indeed."
Yeah. Thank you, both of you, for being here on this call. It is.
Thank you so much. That was really lovely.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you.